This might seem like a bit of a weird comparison. After all, the MPC-1 is almost double the price of the Novation Circuit Rhythm. But I wanted to cover this because these kind of aim to accomplish similar things at very different price points. And this video will hopefully help you decide whether spending quite a bit extra on a standalone music production device is worth it to you, or what the trade-offs are between a less expensive and more expensive device. There's a bunch to unpack, so without any further introduction, let's get into it. The Novation Circuit Rhythm is super portable. It's slim, lightweight, and has a rechargeable internal battery. It's charged via its USB-C port, and because of all that, it's really easy to just put in a backpack, bring pretty much anywhere, and make music wherever you happen to be as long as you have a pair of headphones. I would definitely take this on things like lunch breaks from work, or just take it to a cafe or outside to get a change of environment and make beats there. Overall, the circuit is built from the ground up to be super portable, and it definitely wins in this category. Not so much the case for the MPC-1. This thing is a metal beast of a device, and it is as heavy as it looks. I'd definitely be more hesitant to just throw it in a backpack if I was going to be walking around a lot, and unlike the circuit, it's not battery powered. You do have to plug it into a wall with the provided power cable and power brick. I have seen some people power it via USB with a power bank. I would approach that very carefully because I've seen some people say that if you do it wrong, you could significantly shorten the MPC's lifespan. But still, the MPC-1 is a standalone device, and it's pretty compact for what it can do. It's definitely more compact than some of the older MPCs or stuff like the Machine Plus, which is a monster. I wouldn't mind taking this to a cafe or using it on the couch as long as there's a power outlet nearby, but there's definitely more friction involved than with the circuit. Up next, let's talk about loading and storing sounds, starting with the similarities. Both devices can have sounds directly recorded into them using the 1/4-inch stereo inputs. And both devices can take some form of SD card to expand their storage capacity. From there, they do split off. To load sounds into the Circuit Rhythm, you need to use the free components editor, which is pretty easy to use. You just drag and drop sounds or groups of sounds. Sounds are organized into packs, and the amount of sample time that each pack can hold is frustratingly limited. But fortunately, you can load multiple packs onto the circuit at once using the micro SD card, and then access them here. I should also mention that the Circuit Rhythm can resample its own input, which is really cool. So that becomes... For the MPC-1, loading sounds is even easier. You just insert the SD card, drag your sounds in, and that's it. You're good to go. And any folders you create will show up in the MPC's menu. There's also a built-in integration with Splice Sounds. It's a little bit janky. You do need an Ethernet cable, and it downloads your entire Splice library all at once. But now, I have my entire Splice library on this thing, which is super nice to have. And I am quite a Splice sample hoarder to begin with, so I've got a lot to work with now. Pretty much any sound I could possibly want at my fingertips. The other thing I should mention is that both the MPC and the circuit can't just stream sounds directly off of their SD cards. They have to load them first. But the MPC has significantly more memory to work with when you load sounds in. So when loading sounds in, you can either create full packs for yourself, or you can go in and select sounds, load them into the active memory, and then you can assign them to the pads. These samples will integrate themselves into the sound engine, which is what I'm going to talk about next. The Novation Circuit Rhythm's sound engine is built on samples only. You have 8 tracks to work with, and each track can only play one sound at a time. You can also switch between multiple sounds on each track. You can play one-shots, like I just showed, or you can map your samples to a keyboard. Also, notice how as I pitch a sample down, it slows down, and if I pitch it up, it speeds up. You can also chop samples on both devices, and I'll get to that in a dedicated section of this video, but from there, you can shape your sounds with the macro knobs. You can also shape your sounds with effects, but I'll get to that in the next section. I should mention that any samples you bring into the circuit tracks do get collapsed down to mono, which is unfortunate. But other than that, the sound engine sounds good enough and definitely gives you enough to build some proper tracks with. The MPC-1 can do pretty much everything the Circuit Rhythm can do, but with way more features. For instance, you can build up full kits of one-shots on one single track and have independent effects on each pad. So in this case, I've got all these sounds laid out on the pads. And for one thing, if I hit 16 levels, I can dive into a bunch of different parameters that now get mapped out to the pads, including pitch. In this mode, you can only play one sound at a time, much like the Circuit Rhythm, but stay tuned because that is not the only way to play sounds across a keyboard on this thing. And like I mentioned, if I go into Program Edit, I've got all of these parameters to work with. So I can layer multiple samples into one pad, and I've got all of this control over the balance of all those layers. I've got amp envelopes and filter envelopes to work with full ADSR, which is super nice to have. I've got LFO stuff in here, and like I mentioned, individual effects on each pad. Each pad has its own individual effects, which is super powerful. Like basically, each one of these pads is its own mini track contained within the larger 8 tracks, which is super powerful. It's like the Circuit Rhythm on steroids. And the MPC keeps your samples stereo and high quality in general. I also mentioned that there are more ways to map sounds to a keyboard with key group programs. So let me pull up this bass. This is a sample mapped to a keyboard, and you can choose a bunch of different scales. And once again, you've got a ton of parameters for layering. So you can have a bunch of different sounds layered, and you can even have different samples that correlate with different regions of the keyboard for a bit more realism in your instrument, or just so they don't get kind of degraded when you pitch stuff way up or way down. That might seem a bit complicated to set up, but this also has a feature called Auto Sampler, which allows you to plug in a synth via MIDI and audio cables, and then it'll automatically trigger notes, record those in, and map them to a keyboard, which is super powerful. The MPC also does have time stretching built in, which the Rhythm does not. Overall, the MPC-1 has a ton of power when it comes to dealing with sounds, and I haven't even gotten into the synths yet. They vary in quality a bit. The electric piano one is a pretty nice one. And you'll notice you can play one-finger chords or lay out your notes in different ways, like I mentioned earlier. And there are a couple of synth plugins. Overall, I am pretty happy with the Circuit Rhythm's sound engine, but the MPC's sound engine blows it out of the water. It's not even a fair competition. But of course, they are at different price points. And we haven't even gotten into the effects yet, which is what we're going to talk about next. For the Circuit Rhythm, you have a few effects on a track-by-track basis. Distortion, high and low cut filters, and resonance. You also have master reverb and delay, and sidechain on each individual track. You also have a built-in master compressor, which you don't really get to control the parameters of, a master filter, and grid effects. The MPC has all that stuff and a whole lot more with much more control. So let me jump into these pads again. If I go to the effects tab, you've got 4 effects that you can have on a per pad basis or on a per track basis. You can do both if you want to. So you've got EQs with a lot more controls to them, both filters and parametric stuff. Duckers, distortions, compressors, reverbs, delays, and modulation sources such as phasers. And once again, you've got plenty of controls to work with. There's a lot more in here. I'm barely scratching the surface, but hopefully that at least gives you an idea. And I've already mentioned the individual sound amp and filter envelopes that you've got a ton of control over. And like the rhythm, this also has master effects that you can control with an XY grid, which is pretty cool. You can also export the individual tracks of the MPC-1, including on a pad-by-pad basis, so you can do arrangement and final mixing and mastering in your DAW. Over time, I've come to really embrace a hybrid workflow between standalone devices and my DAW, so this is really nice to have. The Circuit Rhythm doesn't have this, which is really unfortunate. Up next, sample chopping. Chopping samples on the Circuit Rhythm is super simple and pretty powerful. All you have to do is select a sample, change your sample mode to slice, select how you want the circuit to divide it up automatically, whether it's 16, 8, or 4 chops, and then you can set those chop points custom if you want to. Once you set those chop points, you can fine-tune them using the start and length parameters. Let this ring out further. Have even samples overlapping, and then, of course, pitch everything down to change the tempo. I really like the way that they've set it up to use the pads as the screen without sacrificing fine control. MPCs are famous for being a family of sample chopping powerhouses, and the MPC-1 is no exception. I'm going to quickly walk you through the process. It's slightly more convoluted, but the trade-off is that you get a lot more flexibility. So I've got a sample loaded up. Once I've gone to sample edit and advanced this window to the chopping window, I've got multiple different options for how I can chop this sample. It can do it by threshold, so it will look for the transients. It can do it by regions or by tempo. In this case, I want to do it manually, much like I showed on the Circuit Rhythm. Once I've done that, I can either edit these and process them, or I can convert them to a new drum program, which will map them to the pads and actually get into the beat making process. And of course, I can edit them after the fact, and I can choose whether or not the end of the sample coincides with the beginning of the next one. You have the ability to choose how that will behave, although you will have to set that up in the previous step. This isn't meant to be a super in-depth tutorial. Moving on to user interfaces, this is an area where the cheaper device might actually win, at least for ease of use. The Circuit Rhythm's interface is really well thought out to be as fast and intuitive as possible, and not having a screen actually helps make that happen. Everything is super easily accessible from your tracks, your patterns, your note layout, which looks intimidating until you realize this is basically just a piano roll with like a couple of extra steps. You've got your mixer, effects, all of this is really quick to use. Everything is just a button press or two away. The circuits workflow is one of the best in the game, and it does help that I've been using Novation's various circuits for years. You can check out videos where I've made beats from scratch to get a much better idea of how the workflow goes. But at this point, for me, the workflow is just embedded into my muscle memory, to the point that I don't even have to think about it anymore. Getting to that point with the MPC-1 took a bit longer, but I am happy to say that at this point, using it is fairly automatic. I'm able to navigate working with tracks and how they all interconnect pretty cleanly, and it did take me a while longer, partially because it's just inherently more complicated, and partially because I think the UI could have maybe used one more pass before getting put out. They have made improvements over time via firmware updates, which is very much appreciated, but every now and again you'll probably run into some stuff that will seem like a limitation until you do some looking in the manual and find there's an obscure solution. It's not quite as clean and seamless as the Rhythms is, but that's probably impossible given just how many features they've crammed into this box. You do have a lot of buttons that get you to a lot of different functions, and a bit of the pads are the screen behavior, which is super nice, but you do have quite a few shift commands and a bit of switching back and forth, a little bit of menu diving, and you will have to rely on the touchscreen to a degree. I don't think there's any getting around that, especially if you want to make very fine tweaks. You will find yourself reaching for the touchscreen. It doesn't get in the way of using this device unless you're sight impaired, but it is good to know going in. And finally, let's talk performance. I showed the patterns window a second ago, and this is where all the building blocks of song sections can live. Different patterns contain different note data and instrument data. You can launch those on the fly, or chain those together. mutes, and you can group different combinations of patterns into scenes, so you can cause more drastic changes in your songs. And you can even switch between entire projects to build up a larger live set, which makes this absolutely fantastic for live performance. And of course, I already showed you the grid effects as well. If you've ever seen someone do a performance/DJ set with a Launchpad, this is by the same company, and it follows very much the same design approach. It's built for live performance, and it can be as risky or foolproof as you want it to be. The MPC One isn't quite as set up for live performance as the Circuit Rhythm is, but that's honestly fine. I'm using this as a beat-making device first and foremost. You definitely can do some performance on this thing. For one thing, when you've got all these pads laid out, you can do some live finger drumming stuff. And of course, you do have the ability to launch different sequences. You've got quite a few sequences to work with too. So you can build up something pretty large and complicated if you want to, but you might find yourself ever so slightly limited by the track count. Basically, you can absolutely use this for a full live set with its MIDI control features, ton of sequences, and banks of pads all loaded onto one track. You could totally build multiple songs within one project. But you will have to do a bit more switching between different views, and it's not quite as clean, and you can't switch between entire projects. So bear that in mind. It's good for performance, but it's not as super quick and immediate as the Rhythm is. But I should give the disclaimer that I'm newer to the MPC ecosystem than I am to the Circuit ecosystem, and I know there are definitely lots of people out there who swear by MPCs for live performance. So be sure to leave corrections in the comments if there's something that makes this way easier to perform live on. I'd love to read those and give it a go. If you'd like to see what the process is like for learning both devices and making beats on them, you might want to check out these videos up over here. I documented my first days with both devices, learning them and giving my first impressions. So definitely check those out. And regardless, thank you so much for watching.